Oh, real life people. It's nice to see you all.
Hello.
Shyam,
Hello.
thank you so much for coming out. Yeah, let's get some water going. Thank you. And thanks for bringing the sunshine. It's, yeah, thanks, yeah. Don't know where you found it. We've certainly not been able to get any of it. But fabulous to have you here. I mean, as a reader, as a fan of your work, just so thrilled to have a new book from you. So that's definitely an exciting moment. And I think before we get to Mansions of the Moon, I just wanted to say that we're coming up on almost 30 years since Funny Boy came out.
28, yeah.
Yeah, and what a thrill that book is. And I just wanted to sort of look at that in the light of that. I think it might have been a New York Times review that said, Selvadurai can make family squabbles resonate with almost epic force and weight, and his beautifully manipulated plot powerfully expresses the manifold connections among familial, political, and sexual identity and destiny. And so it's interesting that Mansions of the Moon comes out 30 years after that and is a very different book set in a very different time, but that same quote could well describe much of what it does.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, I thought that was quite beautiful when I was looking at those quotes. It's about a woman, Mansions of the Moon, but it's also about a couple. It's about family. It's about relationships. It's about political sagas, the pushes and pulls of destiny, fate, agency. So lots of those themes are still here. Shyam, the story of the Buddha, of course, has been told many times and has found ways of being new life breathed into it in contemporary retellings, whether it's Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha or Thich Nhat Hanh's, the tales of his life. But and we all know it, the young man who has this auspicious birth, who lives in luxury, grows up as a royal, then renounces those luxuries and his family, Yasodhara, his wife, and his child, and then goes through penances, enlightenment, and so on. But Yasodhara appears and disappears as a short footnote, as a shadowy figure there. In fact, we did a class play in my school based on Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia. And the girl who played Yasodhara didn't really want to speak any lines, and she got that part because all she had to do was lie in a corner and sort of just sleep while Buddha crept out of the room. Which is true. That is how literature remembers Yasodhara. So I want to ask you, you've written a book in which Yasodhara is at the center of a 400-page novel. How did you come to her?
Well, I mean, I've been very interested in Buddhism since the early 2000s and sort of was following it. I mean, I had read all the stories. I mean, I read a lot. I read the Jatakas and I'd read a bunch of other stuff. And I'd read this collection of stories that had been translated by a Sri Lankan academic named Ranjini Obesekara. And it was called Portraits of Buddhist Women. And they were wonderful stories. And they were riveting in their kind of, in the women's agony and the suffering they go through, often loss of a child or a grandchild, and then how through Buddhism they come to some sort of, usually through an encounter with the Buddha, they come to some sort of reconciliation with this loss. So I love the stories, and I asked Ranjini if she'd come and speak at the Gaul Literary Festival, which I was running at that time, and she said she'd like to come but speak about Yasodhara, the Buddha's wife. And I knew he had a wife, and like you said, she seemed a footnote. So I was a bit surprised, and the reason she wanted to speak about it was because she translated this Sri Lankan Sinhalese poem called the Yasodhara Vata, which is a lament of Yasodhara. And she sent me a copy of it, and in the introduction, she explained why that this woman was pretty much absent and that from the original text, but over time, people had been drawn to her, writers had been drawn to her. And reading this lament, I felt, despite its formal structure, that there was something very powerful about this idea of being abandoned by those we love. And I think I felt that I could see why people had been attracted to her, why writers had been attracted to her over time. And this Yasodhara Vata is sung or chanted at funerals, which is the final abandonment by people we love. And so I just became interested in it. And at the same time, I had sort of this other stream coming at me, which was I really wanted to write about a marriage. Yeah. I really was very interested in writing about marriage. And so and then in this Siddhartha thing, they all kind of met, and it just went from there.
Lovely. But you did mention that writers have been interested in her, although I've seen a few, not a lot. I remember the Telugu writer Volga did a wonderful book recently. But what did you have to go by? I mean, there wasn't. It was an oral literature at that point, right? And
well, I had the portraits. I had Ranjini's book, which gave me a sense of the portraits of Buddhist women, gave me a sense of the kind of volition of their lives and their passion. So I had that. And some scholars, some female scholars, had actually been able to collect quite a bit of information on women of that time. And I was surprised to discover that Indian women or South Asian women at that point had more freedom than they would subsequently have in India. So there wasn't a widow burning, for example. Widows remarried, and women like owned property, and there were bride prices, not dowries. Women were allowed to choose often who they married, and there were 5 or 6 choices you could make. And they moved around freely. And reading that and then looking at the women's stories, I could see that was true, because they did move around freely and they did have volition. And even in the sort of like the stories, the Jatak stories always have this kind of preamble that's set in the present day, that is set in like the monasteries or whatever, and then somebody does something and they go to the Buddha and say, why is this happening to this person? And he'll say, okay, this is about their past life. So within those things, you find interesting things about these women. Like there was one nun who was very argumentative, and she would argue with some of the senior monks around theology and stuff like that. So you got this sense of, women sort of, there was this woman who was not a Buddhist, who would go from, but she was an ascetic. She would go from town to town, and when she arrived, she would plant a branch in the ground and then challenge any man to debate with her, and they would always lose. And then finally she met the Buddha, and he bested her. Okay. But so you get this sense of this woman. She's not kind of, she was not the kind of image of Indian women that would subsequently emerge, which is a kind of emptied, obedient vessel for male volition. So I was interested. I thought there was a way to render women or render Yasodhara in the same way I was experiencing these other women.
Yeah, and that's something I really enjoyed about the book. It didn't have this sort of slightly flared nostril pallidity that usually, is applied to any work that refers to Buddha or Buddhism or spirituality in general. And I wonder if you could, since we've been talking about women, share with us a reading from the book, perhaps, that I think is an encounter of Yasodhara and another woman, which maybe gives a sense of how you've been, your approach to their lives.
Okay. So Yasodhara at this point has been married a week to Siddhartha, and she's going now for the traditional visit to the courtesan, Vimala, to discuss if there's been any problems in the marriage bed and if there's any any advice she needs. So, and the word for courtesan is ganika, and dahare means like child or young girl. And, courtesans in that time were figures of great glamour. They were like film stars. And so Yasodhara is very excited. She's going to see this great courtesan, Vimala. So here we are. Yasodhara followed the servant up the dark staircase enclosed in wood to maintain the privacy of the visitor, and also to keep hidden the women's living quarters on the second floor. When she arrived at the receiving room on the third floor, she took a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dimness. And then there she was, the courtesan Vimala, seated cross-legged on a charpoy in a ray of sunshine coming through the window. Lovely, with her enchanting heart-shaped face and rounded hips, breasts straining against her body's cloth, which she wore secured around her neck in an elaborate knot. She beckoned Yasodhara forward with a dimpled smile and said sweetly, "Come, Dahare, join me," patting the charpoy and arranging some cushions for her guest. As Yasodhara climbed onto the charpoy and settled herself, she found herself smiling shyly back under the Ganika's merry gaze, taking in her plump naked arms the press of her voluptuous thighs against the crisp folds of her dhoti, the scent of jasmine from her hair. When Yasodhara was properly settled, Vimala took her guest by the chin and examined her face. So lovely. The entire city speaks of your bridal procession. She turned Yasodhara's face this way and that. Ambapali would be jealous. Yasodhara blushed at this highest compliment a woman could be paid, to be compared to the great courtesan of Vesali, the most beautiful woman in the middle country. And have you met the great Ambapali? She asked, to deflect further compliments. Vimala nodded and mock grimaced. Oh, no woman, especially someone like me, whose beauty is her career, should meet the great Ambapali. I am nothing but a crow compared to her. So, then the stories are true, Yasodhara asked breathless, for she had always longed to see this legendary beauty. Vimala laughed and nodded. They say she's not human, but the daughter of an Apsara, and when you see her, you can believe that is true. Her beauty is unearthly. She took Yasodhara's hand. And now tell me, Dahare, are there any problems in the marital bed? Any questions you want to ask me on how to please your husband? Tell me also how your nights have been this past week. Yasodhara blushed, but then seeing the placid professional interest of the Ganika, she narrated the events of their wedding night and her relations with Siddhartha since. Vimala was genuinely happy, and when she was done, declared with the satisfaction of work well accomplished. Ah, then my Ganika Kusuma trained your husband well. She will be pleased to hear that. She let out a merry laugh as Yasodhara blushed, embarrassed, and also jealous. Vimala took her by the chin again. So very charming. Now cries of "Amme, Amme" made them turn, and Yasodhara saw a little girl running towards the charpoy, her heavy nurse lumbering after her. An open door behind them showed stairs that led down to the private quarters. The girl was holding out a garland of violet flowers, and when she reached the charpoy, she cried, "Amme, see what I made you." Then noticing Yasodhara, she pressed shyly against Vimala. The Ganika lifted the child onto her lap and kissed her all over, crying, "Ah, jewel of my eye." Holding the child close, she looked across at Yasodhara. "Isn't my Visakha lovely?" She kissed the child again, lowered her to the ground, and gently patted her behind, gesturing towards the nurse. The girl went obediently and let the nurse lead her back towards the door. Her parents, Brahmin farmers, died in a plague last year that destroyed their village. Poor thing, left orphaned at 3. So I've adopted her, the true love of my life. Sensing Yasodhara's unasked question, she added, "Her future is assured, Dahare. When she's 13, I will secure a great position for her." She nodded to confirm that Yasodhara had understood what she meant by position, then laughed merrily at her guest's barely concealed dismay. "But this is who we are, Dahare." She reached out and gently pinched her chin.
Thanks, Shyam. And this is what I mean about your book. It sees people as people, people who are sensual, who are flawed, who bear all the problems of their time and then their own special ones. But it interested me what you were saying about women, and Yasodhara has always been described in literature as the one who was left behind. But somewhere through your book and what you say, it's almost like she's the one who stayed in the world, and this is the world. Mm-hmm. It's the Buddha who sort of, or many men in the book who escape by becoming saints or disappearing into forests to hide. But it's the women who are staying in the world, even if it seems like they're inside a smaller space or inside the quarters or sheltered in some way, but actually not, and they're working with the agency they can exercise.
I mean, they're not sheltered in, and they do go out into the world, but at the same time, as we see even in that little reading, Vimala is such a sort of gorgeous figure, but at the end you realize that, okay, that girl is going to, at 13, be handed off to the richest person who will buy her, right? Yeah. So, and we know what happens to that girl subsequently in the book. Yeah. She comes back. So, it's a complex picture. I'm not just saying courtesans are wonderful and it's also, I'm saying that they have this status and they are like film stars, but this is also what they do. And as she says, this is what we do in the Hare. Yeah. So I'm trying to render it in its complexity and in a way, Yasodhara's story is the Buddhist story because she's the one who goes through change, and change is this fundamental idea in Buddhism that she experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what I would love to touch on a little is that it's a book about a spiritual journey or a journey of transformation, but it's also a book about capital, about a time of consumption, about a time not unlike ours in which there was, rapid urbanization, huge amounts of wealth in the hands of a few people, a tussle between rural and urban. So could you tell us a bit about, that?
Well, I mean, what was interesting about the Buddha's era was that there was this urbanization of that Gangetic valley, that sort of now is India, Nepal, and that there was an improvement in technology around agriculture, and that seemed, and I think also climate was contributing to this surplus, and that surplus allowed the rise of this class, this 1%, as we, not different from our 1%, who had this accumulated wealth, and Siddhartha belonged to that. And interestingly, from within that 1%, he said, if I can't, basically saying, if we can't be happy, if I can't be happy, then there is some problem in the world.
Right.
And he was, and that's the sort of the beginning of his journey. And I kind of felt that, because all the Buddha's great monasteries were in the cities of that time, the great cities, Savatthi, or just outside. And so there was one in Savatthi, there was one in Rajgaha, there was, like in Vesali. So you have these kind of, you have this, so it was a very urban religion, which I think is something that's not known about Buddhism. You think it's a forest religion. It isn't. To me, it addresses the problems of urbanization. That we, as even modern people living in the city, experience. And I think that, so it is relevant. I felt it was very relevant. And I think that sense of the book has been urban is very much there when you're reading the book. So, I don't know if I've answered the question. I've drifted off.
No, but in a beautiful way, because I think that is the point that you often hear of the Buddha, the sermon to the deer, or always in a bamboo grove, but it was always on the edges of cities.
Yes,
on the outside, answering the needs of, these city dwellers who are going through enormous change. Yeah. So, and that's why it feels so relevant now when you look at all that we are dealing with. But I think also something beautiful in the way that you've dealt with the structure, because at first glance it's a realist novel. But there's a Buddhist structure to it, it feels like, because it's divided into 3 parts. Each of those parts have a tale. Those tales often have tales inside them. It starts with that thing of like, this is what I have heard, like a present day scenario, and then the work back, like you said, of how did this come to be. But I'm curious about one thing, is that the book is divided into 3 parts. Each part is called dukkha, the same word for each part. And why?
Because actually there's 5 parts. There's dukkha, the froth on the river, dukkha 2, a woman eaten and eaten, and then there's dukkha 3, which is also subtitled 3 Fires. So the idea was that I wanted to come back to the present, because the book, I wanted to sort of mimic that kind of Jataka structure, which starts in the present and then goes back in the past to answer the question of how did this come about, right? So it starts with Yasodhara discovering or finding out that Siddhartha, whom she thought was dead, he must have died because ascetics starved themselves to death, is actually 10 years on, has now emerged as this person called the Awakened One, the Buddha. And lo and behold, he has gone to the most important person in the middle country, Bimbisara, the Emperor Bimbisara, and Emperor Bimbisara has embraced him. So it would be like being embraced by the President of the United States, right? So it's like, it's that big. And then everybody, because he has embraced him, everybody in Rajgaha, the New York at that time, has embraced him, right? So like, do you know what I mean? And so she's trying to now, and she's just...
And she's pretty annoyed
she's
by this.
She's furious. She's furious, you know, and she's like, I've just made some progress and now this man has come back, you know, and one of the first she says is, I wish he was dead, you know, and so... And then it comes, so it goes back into the past, and then it comes forward again, then it goes back. So it's just sort of, and then it finally comes into the present again and continues on in the present.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a great structure, and I want to come to that and to this idea of changeability that you were saying that's so central to Buddhism. The idea that people can change, can transform, can undergo huge restructurings of themselves, and it's not just Siddhartha who's always known to have this massive change, and I think he comes back from 12 years being the governor of a northern province, which is quite rural or even edging on the forest, and he comes to the court and he describes it as a crowding and bumping of desires, and that it's a parody of life. But the other person who's changed is Yasodhara, and I love the lines that you say there, that she comes back and sees 12 years later, the power struggles, and sees her life as it would be in the women's quarters and the sleaze of an emperor with a young concubine. And she says, when she returned to the courtyard, she felt suddenly as if women had transformed in her absence, in the way a traveler in a ghost tale might become aware that his fellow travelers are not humans, but ghosts who have a deadly purpose for him. And so that, you know, you see that she is changing. I'd love to hear a bit more from you on changeability and whether that, I mean, as a Buddhist principle, and how that maybe relates to you as well.
Well, I mean, I think central to, or one of the central things in Buddhism is this idea that of change, and everything changes and changes and changes, and there is no stability. And the thing that changes most, or the thing we struggle with most, is the idea that yourself changes. Yourself isn't stable, and who you were as a child is not who you are as a teenager. And that by what Buddhism says is, by clinging to this idea that the self is stable, you cause yourself a lot of unhappiness and damage. And by the self, what is also meant the status of the self. I am the emperor, I am a writer, I am, you know, etc. Or conversely, I have been victimized, and I am a victim, and I have, none of which is not true. Because all this happens, because the world happens, right? It does not happen. It's not an illusion, but it's the idea that you name yourself something and you hang on to it when there is the potential for change, to accept that you change, and there's a kind of freedom that comes with accepting that everything changes and changes. And so and the reason actually I fell into Buddhism was that I'd sort of in the early 2000s, the kind of trauma around what happened in Sri Lanka in the Civil War finally surfaced in me. And I had to, I did the correct thing and went for therapy and all that. It was very useful, but after some time, I felt I'd hit a block there, and it took me some time to understand that, you get to this place where you're cosseting this traumatized self, and then you can't get out of this cycle, because that's what counseling often does. It tell me how you feel, how's this, and you can't get out of it. And through encountering Buddhism, I realized that I don't have to be that person. Yes, it is true, it's part of my past. Yes, it is true that this has happened and it has produced an effect. But I don't have to be that person, because that person is unstable. That person is unstable, and that person, changes and changes. And of course you carry your past with you. Yeah. Of course, you carry your karma, right? Yeah. And the karma produces effects, but you don't have to be the karma. And so I found that's, I suppose, how change. So Yasodhara herself must constantly have to deal with this, must constantly have to deal with change that's imposed on her, and how she adjusts to it, and how she rises to this changeability of life. So while he is off discovering this thing, she's living it. So I wanted that to be the kind of, because I wanted that to be sort of the kind of almost subtle parallel journey these two people go on.
Yeah, I mean, and I think in this time we have all had to get used to change at a speed that we couldn't have foretold, and at a scale, at a global scale, and so that we really feel that now. So again, I thank you for this book for all those reasons. I wonder what you think, though, because for you, I mean, you said Buddhism is a practice, and it emerges also from coming from there, and that has been something that you've held in your life. But there is a lot of talk now of mindfulness and it is because it's an urban religion. I think that is very much inside large urban centers over here, for example. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think that anything that helps you is good. I mean, anything that helps you is useful. I can only say for myself that mindfulness in itself is not enough. That to me, it has to be tied to that ethical framework of Buddhism. So it doesn't in itself provide the release that I seek. I think that for me, because the Buddha never intended that meditation was an end in itself. He intended it to be a way of focusing your mind so that you could see clearer by stepping back a little, the precepts of Buddhism. Change being one of them, and karma, and the idea that everything you think, feel, or do or say produces an effect. And that effect you're stuck with. And then that effect will produce another effect. It will produce another cause, that there's the cause effect. And so meditation is supposed to make you aware of that and to ponder on that. So it's not supposed to be a marathon. It's not supposed to be, I meditate. I may go to an ashram and I meditate 12 hours or whatever, but then if that meditation hasn't taken you to this place, then you're just going to come back and continue on as is, right? So I think that to me, for me, I'm not saying if anybody else, I'm saying for me, it has to be tied to the thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is in many ways, many of the spiritual practices that we see, whether it's a physical practice like yoga or when you talk of mindfulness, they have been dissociated here from other practices and seem to, exist in sort of a space of simply an exercise, which is, where I was where I was going really. So
Sure,
yeah.
and it's also embraced by corporate culture, no?
Yes.
If you get up at it's also
Yeah.
part of that neoliberal idea of the maximization of the self, right?
Right.
If you get up at 4:30 and then you pump some weight and then you meditate for an hour and then you go to your stock exchange job, you will do better. You will make more money. So that it's
You've got me convinced.
Somehow there is a kind of it's somehow it's actually become part of this neoliberal idea of the self, which I find, which is the very last thing that Buddhism is saying.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wonder actually, because there is that view that you have, and I'm curious because you came to Canada as an adult, as I did, as I'm sure other people did, with a writer's eye, and I'm curious because you've seen, in a way, for me, the work you've done here is take someone who's been erased from history, and I wonder what you saw and what you see of the erasures and silences here in the stories that I hear, and whether, what you think of what's happened in the time since you came.
Oh, well, I mean, it's quite transformed in terms of having more sort of what we call BIPOC voices in the mainstream, and these writers who are coming up. And I mean, when I wrote Funny Boy, there was practically nobody. So it's it's wonderful. It's a wonderful time to be a reader.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It took me so much time here to even realize that there are old stories here. I had arrived with the sort of insolence of an ancient culture saying, everything here popped up yesterday. There's nothing. And then you realize there are stories that have been here forever, and it's just that they've been silenced or erased. And it's an active thing. It's not like they just fizzled out.
Yeah.
There's empire behind it, and money and weight and the hegemony of language and capital and all of that, which is again something that you really do marvelously in the book. I do want to leave some time for folks to ask questions, because I'm sure there are there. So please start thinking of them. But I just had one more thing I wanted to ask you about, Shyam, which is, I mean, to me, again, like I was saying, what you've done in this book with Yasodhara is an act of restoration, in a way. And I think it's writing as an act of restoration, of challenging historical record, in a sense, or as an act of healing too. And there was a project I heard about that you were part of, that you inaugurated about 10 years ago, and this was called Writing to Reconcile, in Sri Lanka. Yeah. And so I'm thinking of your work, very actively writing as being a part of the world. Yeah. I just wanted to hear a bit about Writing to Reconcile and what you were doing.
About Write to Reconcile itself? Yeah. Oh, it was a project I did for 3 years, in which I gathered students from across the country, from the various communities, to write about the war and post-war and trauma and memory and reconciliation, and also sort of there was a component of going out and talking to people, and a component of people feeling. So I mean, and then I basically taught them creative writing. I taught them the craft of creative writing, and then I worked with each of those students through a short story or some poetry or a chapter of a novel that dealt with this subject, and that we then printed in anthology. We did 3 anthologies, one for each year. And it was a marvelous project. It's probably the thing I'm most proud of ever having done. And I really loved doing it, and I loved being with those young people, and I loved their stories, and I just really liked everything. I mean, I liked everything about it, but after the 3rd year, it felt like it had come to its end, and I didn't want to continue doing it, because I felt that I had done it, and that there were 3 anthologies, and that it would start to get repetitive, and I didn't really want to be, because by then everybody was trying to throw money at me because this was a successful project.
Right.
So I didn't want to be like a kind of institutionalized NGO type person, like I just did not want to do that. Yeah.
Oh, but thank you. I mean, I read about the project and I thought this is incredible. For 3 years, you did this, the storytelling as an act of healing and as an act of sharing. And we know that things are tough in Sri Lanka right now. We were just talking about that. But, thank you for the work in doing that.
I got more out of it, I think, than the students did.
Yeah. Well, I do want to know if folks in the audience have questions for Shyam. There is one already. Okay.
If I may, please.
Please.
These events that you have written about
Yes.
occurred from 2,500 years ago,
Yes.
or thereabouts.
Yeah.
Yes, 25 centuries. All those recordings of events of that time was what was researched. And you did your research in presumably either your Sri Lankan language, whatever it may be, or English.
English.
Where is the connection
Between what and what?
from the original language? And
Well,
what was the language that was used back then?
we don't know what the language was because it was oral. I think they call it Prakrit, and then there was a second language they say called Greater Magadhi that would have existed, and then it was because it was an oral culture, and it was only put into written culture, I think, in 2nd century AD, maybe. And so, however, I mean, the debate.
100 years later.
Yes. So the debate would be around, I mean, it's very scholarly, right? It's a scholarly debate about whether oral history is as accurate as written history. And some people say, yes, it is. Some people say, no, it isn't. So from what we have, which is the Pali Canon, we have a number of things that we can extrapolate from. And that's what that's what I did. I just used that because I'm not writing an academic treatise. I'm writing a fictional account of what we think happened at that time. So I just used what was available, and there's a fair amount of, there's a lot of scholarly work on the period, and that I was able to access because I was very lucky to have this academic at the University of Toronto, Christoph Emmerich, who was able to understand how a fiction writer would need to research, or what a fiction writer needed to know as opposed to an academic. And so he would direct me, I would ask him specific questions, and he would direct me towards specific books. And then I would just read them, and what I could find I used, what I couldn't find I extrapolated from where we could find it backwards, and wrote the book.
But that was all in English.
Yes.
Back in 2,500 years ago when these things were recorded.
Yes.
And they've been brought down in history.
Yes.
From what language have they come down?
Oh, I see. Well, they would have come from Pali, and then that Pali would have been translated into Sanskrit, would have been translated into Sinhala, would have, at one point, things got lost because Buddhism faded out. It faded right out. Out of India. And then it would have gone to China and Thailand. So these works are coming back and forth between these people because they get lost over time. Empires come and go, but somebody will have them somewhere, and then they come back. And then there's that famous Chinese monk who I can't remember, but he came to India and he translated a bunch of that stuff into Chinese, whatever I'm just going to say Chinese, and then that was over there, and then it had to be brought back. So it's really fascinating how these things are constantly going on. And even through colonialism, this is going on. There's this other thing that's running back and forth in Asia around Buddhism, this scholarly stuff, and this movement of these monks moving this stuff around, and because things literally get lost, and then they have to be translated. And so, yeah.
Do they link it up is the question that I wanted.
What do you mean by link it up?
From the lost languages to current
I don't know how they do it.
At
You
some
would have
point, there
to-
were centuries of gap,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah, there's
between,
sometimes centuries of gaps.
Big question of all these events that took place.
Yes.
Presumably during the time of Buddha, it was in India.
It was in,
Contemporary was
yes,
the time.
yeah.
So in India, what language was it used at the time?
Well, in that,
And you say Pali, I have not heard of that language.
oh, it's Pali is a sort of well-known Buddhist language,
Yeah.
and
But whether it was used in India or not.
it would have been used in India. It
in,
would have
in
been
and
a written
around
language.
Bihar or northern Uttar
Yeah,
Pradesh
it would
near
have
the
been
Nepal
written down.
border.
I mean,
yeah.
the Pali. It's
Yeah.
called the Pali Canon. The original work is now called It is the Pali Canon, and
Yeah.
that is what we have. That's closest to what the Buddha might have spoken.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have that language. That language is gone.
We've lost, I don't know, what is it, almost 4,000 languages, even in
Yeah.
the last, in
Yeah.
the last 400-500
Yeah.
years. So it's
Yeah.
quite incredible that something that has a solid literature that was used,
Yeah.
that birthed a religion even,
Yeah.
might just disappear. It's fascinating. So thanks for. There are these massive gaps. There are sometimes 2 centuries between, a religious leader and then any work that even
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yes, exactly.
There's that big, huge gap where you know that this is not what he
Yeah,
said.
yeah.
This is what someone a century or more later said. So that's a fascinating question. Does anyone else have this? Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Maybe know why you call the book Mansions of the Moon.
It's a quote from one of the poems in what's called the Therigatha, which is a song of the sisters and songs of nuns. And what I liked about what it's saying is that, here, I'll just read it out to you. Fools who don't know things as they really are revere the mansions of the moon and tend the fires in the wood, thinking this purity. So what's being said is that in this thing is we spend a lot of time, devote a lot of time to things that are not important, that the important, we get lost in that, and we are not aware of the truth. And so that's what it's saying, because all that it's describing, the mansions of the moon, the fires in the wood, is the sort of Vedic religion against which Buddhism and also Jainism is rebelling against that kind of mindless ritual. So that's one aspect of it, but Mansions of the Moon is also the place where the soul goes before it rises up to the land of the ancestors or the land of the fathers. So it's a kind of limbo as well. There's a kind of limbo aspect to it.
A halfway house to,
A halfway
to
house.
eternity.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, the mansions of the moon also it's an astrology, I mean, in
Yes,
Hinduism you
yes.
have 27, 28 mansions of the moon, and so you have, the moon and the sun. In fact, in the book, the Buddha's and Yasodhara's nicknames for each other are Surya and Ushas, the sun and the dawn. So very much in India there's this idea that the moon and the sun, you're either a child of this or that, or your lineage is that. So yeah, it's
Those
beautiful.
words and the characters' names, they are all Sanskrit.
No, they're not, because the Sanskrit would be Yasodhara, the Pali is Yasodhara. So if, in Sri Lanka, you don't say Yasodhara, you say Yasodhara, because the sh sound does not exist in Pali. It exists a Sanskrit sound.
I find it so fascinating of how, in a way, these cultures rubbed up against each other and which gave what to what. Because I remember, there's this very central concept in Hinduism, in a lot of the performative arts, for example, of the 9 emotions, the 9 rasas. It's a very central theory that there are 9 basic emotions. That's your palette.
Yeah.
Then you can mix jealousy and anger and get, envy. You can mix, there's all of that.
Yeah.
But there used to be only 8 emotions until Buddhism came on, and then karuna or compassion became the 9th.
Right. Interesting.
So these religions do borrow from each other.
Yeah, they
were
do.
living next
They're
to
in
each other,
conversation with each other.
in constant
Hinduism
conversation.
and Buddhism are in conversation with each other because they're also competing. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
I don't want to go on about it because I'm not a scholar.
No,
but I've
no,
certainly
no,
had
but-
some very interesting, thoughts about it.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a question at the back. Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. Just by happenstance, happened to catch Frank Gleason's play, Shakespeare's Will, recently in Ottawa, and I'd never read it.
What's it? Sorry?
Shakespeare's Will.
Okay.
And it's a writing of the life of Shakespeare from the perspective of his wife,
Uh-huh.
Anne Hathaway. And some really interesting parallels, I think, between your work and that work in terms of reflections on marriage perspective and historical, sort of what we take as historical fact. But what I left leaving that play with, and I expect might be a feeling leaving from your book, is whether there were any conflicts or moments of clarity in writing from the female perspective, particularly in dealing with the historicity of it. So I was curious about that, and just a sidebar fact: the Chinese monk was Hume Sam.
That's it.
And this is just, not to brag, but really it's the product of the Indian school system that drills random facts into you. So when you mentioned that, all I could think about
Yeah.
was
It's brought out in moments like this, all that training was
All
worth
the
it.
memorizing, the memorizing. Yeah. Yeah. So say that again, the conflicts and what? Points of clarity. I mean, it's like when you're writing fiction, once you find your way into the character's point of view, then that becomes the center of everything. So whatever clarity she has is what clarity there is. And whatever conflicts she has are what exists in the book. So it's not I don't experience it as a kind of cathartic experience. Writing fiction, or writing period, I don't find it cathartic. I find that it's a kind of artistic practice, and I'm in it. And what keeps me writing is a kind of love of the craft and the sort of this marvelous thing that you can shape in various ways. That marvelous thing being the novel that you can shape in various ways, and that. So I'm not really thinking about it like that. I'm not thinking about it as from the like in those terms, right? I mean, yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question. Oh, and I know what I was going to say was that you talked about memorizing in the school system, but one of the things that I could never find a way to get into this book is the fact that these people had much better memories than we do, because everything would have been oral, so that their ability to memorize would have been much far greater than us. But I couldn't find a way to bring that in without stepping out to tell you that. So it's one of the facts. And the second fact that I could never find a place for is the fact that the wheels don't have rubber on them. So, so I try to suggest that they feel the journeys in the chariots and carts feel like they're very juddering, but you can't actually, there's no way for Yasodhara to experience that by saying, oh, I'm feeling like it's very uncomfortable, because this is normal for her, right? So that's another fact that I just could never find a way to get into the book, and I just said, well, that's okay.
I love that these are the two things that are eating you up.
No, they don't eat me up. They don't eat me up, but they were that kind of.
The wheels have no rubber. No, but it is true, and I mean, this has been a constant thing of of how do you find oral narrative back into the form of the book, and I think that's why I feel like it's such a beautiful, I don't know whether it's sly or subtle, it's elegant, the way in which you've given us a realist novel that actually has a very different feel and structure to it, and the fact that there's so much, you can hear language in it as well is really lovely. Sorry, I'm getting carried away, but does anyone have another question in the room?
Oh, yes.
There's one like that. Yeah.
Thank you both for this really interesting discussion, and I found it fascinating for what you said in the beginning. The women are often the footnotes of these stories, and so it wasn't something I had ever thought about till I came across this book. And of course, I suspect some of what I'm curious about I'll learn through the book, which is how curiosity of how she was impacted by his journey. But, so I'm hoping to get some of that through the book. But I'm curious if you think, or if you have any knowledge, and this is partly ignorance and not a lot of knowledge of Buddhism, but how do you think her journey impacted him? Like, do we see elements that we think come from her in Buddhism today?
No. I would have to say no. I think that he, as I write him in the book, I mean, because he's a fictional character in the book, right? As I write him in the book, yes, she is. Yes, she does. Yes, she does affect him because she is this. Because he wants to leave the marriage, and yet he loves her, and so you know what I mean. Like she's a worthy mate for him. She's not, as she's often shown in Indian literature or in Buddhist literature, as this kind of sort of empty vessel, obedient empty vessel. You know, like she's not shown like that. I don't show her like that. I show her as somebody who is a worthy mate to him, an intellectual combatant and an equal, and that this makes his the problem of leaving her greater for him, and that yeah, I mean that becomes a kind of a test in a way to him, because you know. If he didn't love her, or if she was a cipher in his life, then it's easy to leave, right? But it wasn't, and because at some point in the book, when he encounters that ascetic Alara Kalama, who says to him, and he says how, because he asks Alara Kalama, how do you is your path open to everybody? And he says, no, it isn't. It's only for the truly thirsty. And then Siddhartha says, how will I know? How do I know if I'm one of the truly thirsty? And he said, and Alara Kalama says to him, you will know. And the only way for you to know is to go home and love your wife, and then find out. Like, you know what I mean? Like it becomes a kind of thing for him. And then it gets very poignant, right?
Yeah,
it gets very poignant because we know something she doesn't know.
And the Yasodhara in your book is very savvy. I mean, she is actually perhaps when he's early in the Buddha's life, he's an ambitious royal who wants to be the governor, who is playing the game, and she's very alert to alliances and political, intrigue, and he relies on her counsel, and then that pulling away makes it hard. Must have been hard for him too to be unmoored.
And he marries her because he sees that her parents' marriage is the marriage he wants, and he sees that she's like her mother, that she kind of like her mother does with her father, who's also kind of sort of pensive and slightly vacillating. That the mother provides a kind of a firmness and kind of gently but firmly pushes this man along, and he feels that this is what Yasodhara will help him do.
Yeah.
And she does to some extent.
She does.
I mean, she really does.
Yeah.
She really does. I mean, she.
Yeah. I mean, I think, given that it would be, I feel like it's really nice to end with another reading for that reason, because I think it'll be nice to go to the moment when the Buddha actually, one of the figures in the book who I really love and I think is quite central is the Mahakosala, the great emperor who renounces his kingdom and is
all
sort of
imagined, by the way. Yeah?
Sorry,
all imagined. Yes,
but is for Siddhartha a very a hero. He hero worships him, and maybe Mahakosala is the one who introduces him to an ascetic who sets him off on his path. So I'd love to end the evening, I think, with Shyam's words, with that moment.
Okay. So Siddhartha, I mean, has gone to the because the kingdom of the Sakyas, which is where Siddhartha's father is a Raja, or the king of, is under the empire, is under the Kosala Empire. So you have two big empires in that period. You have the Magadha Empire and the Kosala Empire. So this is a vassal state of the Kosala Empire. And so Siddhartha, I invented, because he had a friendship with Pasenadi, the son of Mahakosala, who features a lot in the Buddhist stories. So I figured that how can I predate this friendship? And I sort of thought about it, and I thought of how empire works. Empire works by you get all the noble sons together and you indoctrinate them, right? Yeah. So, as we know well from British Empire. So I figured that if I could invent that, and that he would go to the court of Mahakosala, and he becomes a favorite because he has those qualities that a king needs to have. So now Mahakosala is also very interested in these ascetic schools that are now all over India, all over the middle country at that time. So now they're going to visit an ascetic. The pavilion in the royal garden was brightly lit with many lamps, and when they came up the steps, they found the naked Samana seated cross-legged, his shriveled sex in his lap. The Samana's emaciated body was covered with dust, ribs pressing against thin grey skin, knees and elbow joints painfully bony. He was a Nigantha, and so was slowly starving himself to death to extinguish all possible rebirths. Seeing them, he gestured to a water pot in the pavilion. Thirsty. He didn't wish to gain any further negative karma by lifting the water pot to his lips and destroying the tiny life forms within. Siddhartha picked up the pot and held it up to the ascetic's lips. Many sticks of incense had been lit in there, but he could still smell the man's stench of urine and dried feces. I see, O Samana, that though you won't pick up the pot yourself, you see no contradiction in destroying the light forms by ingesting them. Siddhartha glanced at the Maharaja, who nodded subtly to encourage him, his eyes glittering as if Siddhartha were his favorite horse and he was backing him in a race. The Samana smacked his lips and said nothing, refusing to take up the challenge. After Siddhartha put down the empty pot, he stepped far enough away to diminish the smell and examined the man curiously. Ask me what you will, Sami. The Nigantha gestured at him with his palms open. He smiled thinly to say he knew Siddhartha had been brought to challenge him, but also to let Siddhartha know he was unflustered. Siddhartha had come prepared. Mitta, if you take up the Samana's life, why not follow our Vedic ascetic ways? It seems much more useful to go, like our Samanas, into the forest, and through your mortifications increase your power at the sacrifice, and thus bring strength to the gods and good fortune to us all. Wouldn't that be a worthier path? After all, what does starvation to death achieve for anyone? Ah, but that is the false path, Sami. The ascetic keenly studied Siddhartha's face, as if looking into him. Listen, Sami, I am tired of dragging this body around. Truly, I wish to end my cycles of suffering. Truly, the thought of another birth, no matter how fair, horrifies me. For even in the most pleasant of lives, we know there is suffering. We grow old and sick. We sorrow and hurt. We desire beyond any possible fulfillment. Lose the ones we love most, the things and places we love most. Our bodies that we covet so much become our enemies with age and sickness. But the wisdom of non-action stops all this. But this life which you disparage, Mitta, also contains joy and laughter, Siddhartha said, less certain. It contains love. Ah, but even then the sorrow is ever present, the constant way life, moment to moment, disappoints us. He gave Siddhartha a piercing look for he had seen his uncertainty. Then there is the truth that the very thing we are sure will make us happy, that we are sure will fix what ails us, when we finally get them, come tainted with other things we could not have anticipated, and so they fail and disappoint us. Indeed, they bewilder us